Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
and me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
So today, our question for discussion is, if you haven't made it as a writer by the age of 25, is there still time?
It takes time writing. People think that if you haven't made it as a writer by the time you're 30 or 35, it's over. But writers prove all the time that it's not true. Isn't that right, Irene?
That is so true. I mean, James Michener wrote 40 novels or something like that after he was 40. So we have a lot to shoot for, those of us that are getting a late start. And there was Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote that incredible mass of incredible prairie fiction. And she was getting into her later years when she did it. There was also Wallace Stevens, who got a late start around age 50. My personal favorite example, the Marquis de Sade, late bloomer. And of course, Frank McCourt, who no one ever saw as an author without some sort of gray to white hair. So, we have a lot left in us.
Some think of Alistair MacLeod as, hope for late bloomers too. So, because he didn't necessarily publish a lot until he was really established as an academic. So, our very own local homegrown.
Yeah, and he took his time writing as well because he had a busy life. And there's Alan Bradley, who writes the Flavia de Luce, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, mysteries. And he was 70, I think, when they started. They've been huge bestsellers, and now he's 80, and he's thinking of wrapping it up a bit just in case, because he wants to make sure that everything wraps up nicely. Mary Wesley, I remember, shocked everybody in Britain by writing in her 70s very popular works of fiction that were quite straightforward, which was, code for being a little bit risque, and so she was sort of the risque old lady who wrote books, but sold more than anybody else at the time, and so good on her.
That's cool.
It's not just books either. I do remember years ago reading an interview with an agent at William Morris Agency, and even screenwriters are not always as young as you think. They just lop a few years off their age when they put out the press release, and they're in their 40s and 50s easily a lot when they hit it. So, so it's not all about being 25, which is hopeful.
That's a relief.
That's a huge relief. I've got a bit of catching up, but I will make it. This entire introductory topic has no relation to our guest today. I just want to clarify. No relation whatsoever to our young and vibrant guest. So I'm so pleased that we have Heidi L.M. Jacobs with us today. She was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, where I'm told that the sun sets after 10 p.m. and rises again sometime around 5 a.m. right now, which is so super cool. Wow. She completed her bachelor's and master's degrees in English at the University of Alberta, as well as a master's of library and information science from Western and a PhD in English from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She's currently the English and History Librarian at the University of Windsor and co-director of something very cool, the Center for Digital Scholarship. And she is a superb writer. So her brand new novel is Molly of the Moll, Literary Lass and Purveyor of Fine Footwear, Her History and Misadventures, released just this spring by New West Press. Welcome, Heidi Jacobs.
Hi, nice to be here.
So why Moll Flanders? What about the historical version of the character appealed to you?
Well, it's funny. Because you had mentioned you might talk to me about that, so I brought my original undergrad copy, which I'm holding up to the microphone, which is really useful in a podcast. But what was funny is here's my bookmark from probably page 172 from when I first started as an undergrad, and I didn't finish it then, and it wasn't until I was toward the end of my revisions with this book that I thought I should actually read the whole book, and I did. But one of the things that I found interesting was I had changed the Moll, M-O-L-L, to M-A-L-L as an undergrad, thinking that it was a really funny thing. And so I had the idea years and years and years ago about, wouldn't it be funny to do a book about West Edmonton Mall with Moll Flanders. So it kind of came as a joke, and then I thought, actually, this might work, and so I kept working on it. And the original title for the book was Edmonton Moll Flanders, and we had to change it for a range of reasons, but I think it was one of those things that actually worked, and once we got rid of the title, it still actually sort of worked in terms of coming to terms with who you are and where you're from and all sorts of things that you think are set in stone, which actually are a little more flexible than you might realize. So that's where that came from.
May I just comment for the people who aren't looking at this scene right now that Heidi held up her book and showed us that the bookmark in question was an ATM receipt from CIBC circa 1980 or 90-something.
88, yep.
1988.
September.
What is the most ridiculous thing you've ever used as a bookmark to date?
Wow. Food, probably.
Not
Granola
bacon.
bar.
Not bacon, no.
No.
Like, yeah, just usually it's wrapped,
That's good.
Yeah,
That's
but
helpful.
Yeah.
I'm fond of old lottery tickets too. So.
I used a lot of like plane, boarding passes and train tickets, and I actually tons of my undergrad books have little bus transfers and stuff like that. It's kind of a neat little scrapbook usually as you find out sort of things.
It is. The archaeologists will really dig it one day. I'm confident.
Yeah, and I did have $40. I had $40 in September. Oh, $47.41.
That is an undergrad situation for sure. So your character, Molly, makes she goes on the bus. Mm-hmm. She has her bus passes and gets around on the bus. She seems to avoid taverns and gin joints and debtor's prison. So she also has a little bit of a balance in her bank account. What do you think makes your character a little bit like Moll Flanders? Your Molly like Moll?
Well, there is a part later in the book where her dad actually talks about what he had hoped. So that it necessarily isn't the character, but one of the things that he liked about the name, which he gave to her, was that sort of that sense of triumph over adversity, that ability to overcome obstacles. Now, granted, a romantics paper isn't quite the same as debtor's prison. Of course, it's all sort of relational. But he sort of liked the fact that she persevered and she came out and was sort of victorious and true to herself. And I think that's a really important component of the book. And certainly once I did finally read the book, that's something that I really was happy. It was a happy accident that this happened for her.
It took a long time for you to write this book, you've acknowledged.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest this process in many, many ways, but on the other hand, it's done, and so it worked for me. I started it as a PhD student. I was in a writer's project, and we had to write for like 6 weeks, 5 pages, 5 days a week. So that got really tough, which is good practice actually for writing. It's just actually sitting down and writing when you don't think you have anything to say. And somehow I lucked into, I think that I had that idea about, Moll Flanders. And I started writing that, and people were enjoying it, so I kept writing it. And so by the end of the summer, I had about 60 pages of stuff that I was kind of happy with, and people wanted more. So I would kind of touch on it here and there, but it wasn't probably until about 2012 that I actually in earnest sat down and printed off everything I had and laid it out on a table and realized remarkably that there was a story arc. It was a very happy accident that happened, and then I just started putting it together, and I was on sabbatical. I gave myself a month to see if I could do something with it, like if it was worth salvaging or moving on, and it was really quite remarkable how much, even though I'd only been writing maybe 10 pages a month, I had stuff to work with. A lot ended up on the floor, but I kept an awful lot of it. So that was pretty exciting to actually see that worked.
So what led to your decision to set Molly in the 1990s rather than any other decade?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's some pragmatic reasons. One is I left Edmonton in the mid-90s. It's a city that's undergone some tremendous change in the past 20 or 30 years, and I don't live there anymore, so it just seemed not quite right for me. It didn't sit right to set it in the present day. And as it turns out, one of the things that's been really useful about it is it's also pre-social media. And I think that as a writer gave me a lot more flexibility in terms of what she can do. It gives her lots of time on her own. These days we are never alone, it seems. We're always sort of connected. So it gave her a lot of time to do some reflection, think through things on her own. There's some plot things that wouldn't have worked in the days of social media, that's for sure. I don't want to give out too much. And then just other little things, like some of the jokes could actually get funny because she can't Google certain things, so she goes on sort of, for consumption, for example. She finds out Emily Bronte dies of consumption, and she just assumes that it's just this romantic thing, that she's just overwhelmed by beauty and the moors and the rain and all this stuff. She just dies from how consumed she is. Well, now she would just Google it and realize it's, TB. So I'm able to do some things like that. Keep her in ignorance for a little longer, which is kind of fun.
So the book is really funny, and I hope your publicist submits it for the Leacock Award, because it's just great. So it does have the elements of the romantic comedy along with some lovely satire. I really enjoy satires of English department goings on, so I really love that. About university life and funny descriptions of life in retail. How much of that is autobiographical?
Well, there's some obvious things that I cannot deny, that I did degrees at University of Alberta, and I did work at a very large mall there. But I think, there are some things that are somewhat autobiographical, but they're always totally exaggerated. I mean, the taupe thing, if you ever have worked in a shoe store, you would certainly recognize the taupe, and it's...
I have, and yes.
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So...
and that was for children's shoes.
Oh, okay.
So it's even less relevant than the different hues of taupe.
Yeah. But everyone always asks, are these real professors? Are these real students? And I mean, I've spent my entire adult life sort of in or near English departments, and, everybody's sort of a exaggerated amalgam of types. The microwave thing comes pretty close. There's a microwave toaster oven thing that happens. That's pretty real.
You created a Spotify playlist as a soundtrack for this novel. Tell us about that.
Well, music plays a huge part in her life. She listens to it constantly. It helps her figure things out. It gets her out of her world. It gets her thinking about different things. And so it became really important. You really need to know. You need to hear certain things, and put some bit of Scottish music on there too for her dad. And but yeah, I did want to sort of connect with that sort of multimedia thing for the book.
Have you had a lot of feedback on it?
People think it's really cool. It's an odd little playlist. I don't know if you've listened to it, but there's some Puccini and some Robert Burns and some Oasis, and there is a mixtape in the book itself. So I originally was going to recreate the mixtape, and I thought I'll just do sort of a soundtrack instead.
Mm-hmm. What are you working on something now? What's your next project?
I have got 2 other book contracts right now that I'm excited about. They have absolutely nothing to do with the 19th century, really. One is I just printed it off before coming here, the first draft of a book called 100 Miles of Baseball, which I'm doing with my husband, Daniel Jacobs. And we went to 50 baseball games of all different kinds of levels. And so it's called 100 Miles. I think the working title is One Summer, 50 Games, 2 Voices. And so it's some of that that we've got. And the other book I'm working on is about the Chatham College All-Stars from 1934, which is a black baseball team from Chatham, Ontario, that I'm working on with my colleague Miriam Wright, and we've been working on this project for a couple of years, so we're pretty excited about that. And then Irene and I are doing a project too on sandwich history, and that's pretty exciting.
Yes, it is.
Awesome. When do you expect any of these to come close to?
We're hoping to have a full draft of the 100 Miles by Christmas, and we should be on track for that. And I'm hoping to sneak some time in to write some more fiction too between those.
What is it like to co-author a book with your husband?
Well, we shall see, really. One of the things that is going to be useful about this book is that we do have those two distinct voices. So we shall see, but I think it'll be good.
So who's the bigger baseball fan, you or him?
Well, him, I think. Longer for sure, but yeah, it was a really interesting summer to try and think, because it was one of those things that at the end of the summer I thought, do I still like this sport? So we're, because we did, I'd get home from work at 5:30 and change my shoes and be at the door and drive to Sarnia, like that kind of thing, and back that night. So there were a couple of moments where, what are we doing? But we would always be rewarded by something really quite magical and lovely. So.
Well, we look forward to that book and all of the other projects and just seeing what kinds of things you can use as bookmarks in the future.
Exactly. Well, I could make a little album.
Yeah. So we have a clip from your reading at your fabulous Windsor launch of Molly of the Moll. Could you set it up for us?
Sure. I started at the beginning because I thought that was the best place to start. And what this does is it sets up the whole sort of premise of it and where she got her name. She talks about how her father named his previous children after books on his syllabus, and she just happened to be born the week of Moll Flanders. So that's how that starts, and it also introduces life in the largest shopping mall that she happens to be working at. So.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
When you're named after someone or something, you spend much of your life asking why. Why Rita? Why Sequoia? Why Wayne Gretzky? Most people are named after a grandparent, a favorite aunt, or if you live in Edmonton, a hockey player. Your name might illuminate who you are, a historical moment, or what your parents wanted for you as they gazed lovingly into the tiny, squirmy wad of blankets you once were. Maybe your parents say, you were named after my great aunt Rita, who studied art with Matisse, established a safe haven for feral cats in Regent's Park, and established an art school for underprivileged youth. We wanted to give you a name that conveyed her creative spirit, her compassion, and her commitment to social justice around the world. Or maybe you were told, I named you Sequoia so you'd always be strong and deeply rooted to the earth. Or maybe you were told, we named you Wayne because you were born the day they sold Gretzky to LA, and it's the least we could do for Wayne after all he gave us. I, however, am told, you were named after the novel your father was teaching the day you were born. And now, 20 years later, I find myself at Canada's largest shopping mall trying to explain to someone how it was that I became Molly. I was completing the paperwork for my new summer job at Le Petit Shoe shoe shop and making small chat with Diana, the regional manager of the company that oversees 4 shoe stores in the mall. Polishing my new name tag, Diana said, Molly, that's a name you don't hear often. I was named after Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt. Are you named after a famous Molly? I looked up from my paperwork and saw she was well named with her perfect hair and statuesque posture, and I suddenly felt very short and in need of a haircut. I had to confess, I was named after Daniel Defoe's novel, Moll Flanders. It was written in 1722. Without missing a beat, she said, that is unfortunate, isn't it? And I had to agree. But perhaps I should have used this opportunity to say, my name is Molly, but I go by Camilla, or Lucinda, or Isabella, and then I might not have to have had this hideous name tag in my hand with Le Petit shoe shop sweeping elegantly across the top in a luxurious italic font, while Molly at your service slumped in the middle in mundane Helvetica. After I signed the last piece of paper, Diana proclaimed, you must be thrilled to be here at the premier mall in the country. We think you should be delighted to be part of Le Petit Shoe family. I noticed she left no room for disagreement, so I nodded and attempted to agree wholeheartedly. Working at the mall would be very different from being an English major, but I was feeling up for the challenge. I was no longer Molly, soon-to-be third-year English major. I was now Molly, full-time purveyor of fine footwear at your service. As I made my way home on the bus, toting a large pink binder with manual for the purveyance of fine footwear emblazoned on the cover, I was thinking about how my life might have been different had it been named after a Roman goddess instead of a character in a novel neither of my parents like very much. What I didn't tell Diana was the long story that led to me being named Moll Flanders. As the children of an English professor and an art historian, you might assume that our names would have been chosen with a critical eye to symbolism. However, on the question of our names, there is a long answer and a short answer. I'm still working on the long answer, but the short answer is this. When my oldest sibling, Tess, was born, my father was a newly minted English professor, aglow and agog at the wonders of the British novel. The day she was born, he was preparing to teach Tess of the D'Urbervilles for his The Tragic Vision of Thomas Hardy graduate seminar, and he thought Tess would be a lovely name for his baby girl. My mother, apparently sedated, agreed. She later confessed that she had not finished the book or read my father's dissertation, as she claimed she had. When she did read the novel, she sobbed for our Tess's future. We named our daughter after a murderess. If there is an upside to Tess's name, it is this. Had she been born a week later, my father's class was reading The Return of the Native, and Tess would have been Eustacia Vi, and thus condemned to roam the heath she loathes. As Tess, she merely has dramatically flawed relationships with men, even when they're really nice. The downside of Tess's name is that my parents remained committed to using my father's class schedules to name their subsequent children. When my brother was on the way, my mother was convinced she was having another girl, and she thought that Catherine would be a lovely name. My father, feeling perhaps a bit guilty about the whole Tess thing, succumbed to my mother's lobbying and scheduled Wuthering Heights for his love and thwarted lust in Victorian fiction class around the due date. But Catherine was not to be. Their second child was a boy. After emerging from sedation, my mother agreed to name her new baby after another flawed fictional character, and they welcomed son Heathcliff. By the time I showed up, my mother had given up trying to stack the syllables. Partway through eponymy and eponymity in the British novel, I was born and named after Daniel Defoe's novel, Moll Flanders. A class earlier, I would have been Clarissa, and 2 classes later, Belinda. As my mother told me, your father first argued for Moll, but I got him to agree to Molly. I nodded gratefully, though noted that on every birthday card, note, or memo, my ever-tenacious father spells my name, Molly, with the Y in parentheses. I'm just going to skip a little bit here. Even though Moll Flanders is one of those novels every English major should read, I have gleaned enough facts from the back cover blurb to make me fear it might reveal something horrible about my fate. Here's what I know. Moll led, this is a quote, a life of continued variety where she was 12-year a whore, 5 times a wife, whereof once to her own brother, 12-year a thief, 8-year a transported felon in Virginia, and at last grew rich, lived honest, and died a penitent. I may be even more doomed than Tess. After handing in my final papers last week, I decided that I had a whole summer ahead of me and decided I should use this time constructively to finally read Moll Flanders. I stared at it all last night, but I couldn't bring myself to read more than the first paragraph and the back cover. So instead, I rewrote its back cover blurb. And here's the long quotation, which I'll try and get through in one breath because it's a long 18th century sentence. Okay. After several romantically melancholic years in Paris, where the stunningly stylish Moll Flanders dated 18th century equivalents of Jeremy Irons, John Cusack, and Alan Rickman, Moll moved to London, where she became a cautiously respected artist, fashionably misunderstood novelist, and discreetly sought-after milliner. After a life-altering disagreement with her 18th century Alan Rickman equivalent, who, while riding in a picturesque landscape in the rain, suffers a tragic fall from a very attractive dapple gray horse and utters, "Moll, forgive me," as his final words. The only one to hear his long overdue apology was the dapple gray, who promptly disregarded these words as consequential, Moll set out to make it on her own, possessing only her rapier-like wit and acute sense of style. Period. Sorry, I need Okay. In due time, she became an Augustan-era it girl and found almost true love with an 18th century Noel Gallagher, and then truer love with a John Cusack equivalent. I wrote 12 more versions of the blurb, all of them involving Alan Rickman, John Cusack, rain in a picturesque landscape, and an attractive horse of varying colors. Some included members of Oasis. No matter how many times I rewrote the back cover blurb, I had to come to terms with the fact that this Moll does not live in London, nor Paris, nor does she perambulate within a picturesque landscape sodden with melancholic rain. Rather, this Moll lives in Edmonton, where the men who love her are imaginary, fictional, or weird, and the landscape is flat and snowy 8 months of the year, and millinery is confined to the knitting of toques. Maybe instead of reading Moll Flanders this summer, I should write my own fortunes and misfortunes. And so, dear reader, I ask you, as Moll asks her dear reader on the first page, to, quote, give me leave to speak of myself under that name till I dare own who I have been as well as who I am. So that's the first chapter. And I'm going to just read, because we've got English students, and some of them are like newly graduated. Yay! Congratulations. So one of the things that we have in this book are some graphics. So as we've all been here, this novel covers a couple of semesters. And so she's doing some assignments. And here's one, she was on the phone until about 11, and then her paper's due the next day. We've all been there, right? So this is for her gender constructions of courtship paper that she has to do. So, I'll skip to the middle of the chapter. When I finally got off the phone at about 11 o'clock, I picked up Pride and Prejudice and hugged it tightly. It occurred to me, if I were Elizabeth and I had a Mr. Darcy, he and I would have expressed our feelings for each other in the only possible way. We'd make each other a mixtape. After a long night, here's the beginning of my gender and courtship paper. Pride and Prejudice, the mixtape paper. Introduction. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man wooing a young woman must be compelled to show his affection through the creation of a mixtape. Similarly, a young woman shows her reciprocal affection for a young man through the creation of a response mixtape. While the mixtape is not a mode of courtship available in Miss Austen's time, if Elizabeth and Darcy lived in our time, their wooing most certainly would have involved the creation and exchange of mixtapes. The cassette tape I have included here attempts on side A to tell the story of Pride and Prejudice from Elizabeth's perspective and on side B from Mr. Darcy's. In my selection of music and the accompanying explanatory liner notes, I attempt to show how gender informs how both Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth might have conceived of their relationship had they lived in the 1990s, had access to records, a turntable, and a tape recorder. And then there's some footnotes. In this assignment, I do not mean to imply anything about the musical tastes of Elizabeth or Mr. Darcy. Undoubtedly, both would have been fond of Motown, but it would be highly unlikely Elizabeth would have listened to Cher. Similarly, I predict Mr. Darcy would have balked at listening to the Ramones until Elizabeth gently realigned his limited musical horizons. Unfortunately, I think it highly plausible that Mr. Darcy would have liked both Foreigner and Chicago, and Elizabeth would learn to tolerate this because it might be one of his few failings as the dreamiest literary hero in the British literary tradition. So. All right, and then there's a cassette liner with the contents, and I have to admit the one I kind of like is Mr. Darcy, as Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now by the Smiths. So. Anyway, that will conclude my reading. But,
Christian Laforet is a local author and publisher. For those who love books that keep them up at night, he specializes in horror fiction. Over the last few years, he's shown that he can write for many other genres too, including science fiction and crime, bringing a touch of darkness to everything he writes. We caught up with him at a recent ChiSeries reading at the Phog Lounge in Windsor, and in this clip, he's reading an excerpt from his upcoming novel, The Infested.
Thanks, Ben.
Welcome.
Yeah, let me second his apology for you all having to deal with him for the night. It's awful. So yes, I am going to be reading from my book, The Infested. This is a book that has been a huge, terrible, goddamn weight on my shoulders for so long. I've written it and rewritten it a lot, so I'm happy that it's past this stage, and I just tell myself that whoever takes it won't want to make any changes. I'm sure that'll happen. So I'm going to be reading tonight. I'm going to actually jump into the book. I'm going to read chapter 11. So before I do, I'm going to set it up a bit. And everyone can hear okay? Yes? Okay, perfect. So the story follows a woman named Olivia. She lives in a high-rise apartment building called the New Leaf. She's woken up after a very rough, shit-ass night, and she's woken up to the power being off in her apartment. There's a bad storm outside, and the door to her apartment is wide open. So she goes into the hallway to investigate. She hears somebody making some noise. Down the hall is one of her neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Elliot, and she's on the ground and she's crying. So when Olivia goes over to her, she sees the woman is a bloody mess. The woman says that her husband has assaulted her, and to make matters worse, has abducted the young woman that lives next door to them and has taken the woman into their apartment. So Olivia, stunned by this, because the woman's husband, Mr. Elliot, or Willem Elliot, is in her experience, is a very kind, almost grandfatherly old man. So she can't believe this. So she's going into the apartment to get to the bottom of what's happening. Olivia strained her eyes, willing them to pierce the sheet of darkness which had engulfed her. She'd only moved a few feet past the threshold, but already the world around her felt different, as if the doorframe were actually a gateway to another dimension. "I know what you're doing." It was a lie, of course. She had no idea what the old man was up to, but she felt the need to say something. There was no reply. The only sound filling the air around her was the sorrowful cadence leaking from Mrs. Elliot. The blackness of the Elliott apartment was overwhelming. Olivia couldn't believe that a place could be so dark. Not a place meant for life, at least. Not a sane place. Thoughts of her fallen cell phone came back to her. She wished now she had the presence of mind to grab it. Even with the flashlight dead, the screen would have proved some small hint of light. But how could she have known what she was going to be walking into? The walls of her reality had peeled away while she lay on the bathroom floor, revealing a strange, unfamiliar world underneath. Mr. Elliott? She licked her lips. I know you're in here. Come out now or I'm calling the cops. A small quiver scurried through her words, revealing how paper-thin the confidence was behind them. Olivia turned back to look at the old lady in the hall, now framed in black by the open doorway. What if Mrs. Elliott is wrong? The woman had clearly been beaten up, there was no doubt about that. What if the assault had caused something to break loose in her aged brain? For all Olivia knew, whoever had assailed the old lady had fled. There may be nobody in the Elliott apartment. Still, she figured it better to check. Each step she took deeper into the apartment caused layers of blackness to be pulled back. She saw that her initial impression of the place being utterly without light was wrong. Slowly, dimly, objects and shapes began to materialize around her. These things, which felt as much like alien creatures hiding in the dark as they did furniture, gave Olivia the impression of being watched. They seemed to move and sway as if ready to attack. Straight ahead, she could make out narrow vertical slivers of nighttime light peeking through the blinds covering the dining room windows. Hurrying forwards, hands groping the air before her, she reached the window and pushed the blinds aside. Still holding them, she twisted to look at the room behind her. In the low light, the shapes and forms had become a clutter of antique furniture. It seemed she had been in danger of being attacked by a Chesterfield. She wanted to laugh and knew she probably would do just that, but not until later, not until she was back in her own home and all the craziness was behind her. Using the cord at the edge of the window, she drew the blinds completely open. As they pulled away from her, she took in the ferocity of the storm outside. The trees which surrounded the new leaf rocked and swayed violently. Rain lashed the windows, sheets of water ran down the glass. With the darkness repelled, Olivia felt her confidence grow. She looked over the main living area of the Elliott's apartment and saw that the layout was a near match to her own. She had only ever been in one other apartment in the building, Chloe and Shane's, and since theirs was on the front of the building, along the bow of the D, it had a slightly different floor plan. One thing that caught her attention, though, was the vent cover along the dining room wall. Something had apparently jarred it loose, causing it to hang open. The rectangle beyond was completely black. The faint light pouring through the windows was not enough to reach its depths. Somewhere, buried inside the sheet metal intestine, a wild tapping echoed forth. Olivia told herself it was the sound of the metal heating up under the oppressive pall of warmth filling the new leaf, but the explanation felt as hollow as the shaft exposed before her. Stepping away, she spoke into the empty room. "Mr. Elliott, are you here?" For a moment, she thought she heard something, a deep coughing, but the noise was gobbled up wholesale by a crashing bang of thunder. She checked the guest bathroom and the kitchen. Both were empty. Moving back to the front door, Olivia looked out on Mrs. Elliott again. The woman had sunk to the floor even more so than before. It looked like her body had crumbled under the weight of her sorrow, leaving her a sack of powdered bone and cartilage. She convulsed in time with her sobs. Where the hell is everyone? The new leaf was sparsely populated, but there were still people living there. How was it possible that no one could hear the poor woman lying in the hallway? Just as she returned her attention to the apartment, an explosion of lightning blared in through the windows, washing everything in white. Olivia looked away from the brilliant flash, her eyes having become so accustomed to the murk that the sudden arc of lightning was nearly overwhelming. That's when she noticed it. Sitting in a large wooden pot beside two upside umbrellas was Mr. Elliott's cane. The head, which peeked up over the lip of the pot like a gopher, was that of a silver mallard. Olivia couldn't imagine the man getting very far without his walking aid. She stared at it for a moment before pulling it free from the confines of the wooden pot. The metal handle was oddly cool given the rising heat. It fit nicely into her palm. The cane was sturdy. She realized it would make a nice weapon, if need be, which she supposed is why she was compelled to reach for it in the first place. Holding it before her, she moved deeper into the apartment. The thought that maybe Mrs. Elliott had lost her marbles repeated in Olivia's mind, but with the cane gripped in her hand, she was not as frightened at the prospect of checking the rest of the rooms. She knew either way the police would be needed. Hopefully somebody else would call. If she was lucky, she could avoid the cops altogether. Taking a deep breath, she made her way into the short hallway leading to the bedrooms. The light from the dining room windows did not reach the hall, but with the cane held ahead of her like a lance, Olivia faced down the darkness and continued forward. As she did so, the wail of Mrs. Elliott's crying was replaced by a new sound, a deep shunk. The noise repeated, and then again. It was a horrible sound, one which reminded Olivia of herself trying to pull a booted foot free from the mud as a child, a wet, sucking sound, a sound which had no place in a high-rise apartment building. Wanting the noise to stop, Olivia slapped the cane against a nearby wall and shouted, "That's it, I'm calling the cops, Mr. Elliott." Shunk. Ahead of her was the first of 2 bedrooms. A faint glow of soft orange light came from underneath the door. It took a moment for Olivia's eyes to adjust enough to even be aware of it, but once they had, it glared like a thin horizontal beacon. Shunk. She thought about knocking, but that seemed absurd under the circumstances. Instead, she planned to grab the knob, throw the door open, and confront the old man. Before she could, though, something slammed into the door on the other side. The light along the bottom was smothered. She couldn't see the knob twist thanks to the darkness, but she could hear it. A slow, persistent squeal followed by a click. The door fell open a few inches. Through the gap, Olivia saw 2 things. The first, and what appeared to be the source of the light, was an e-reader. The device was leaning against the bottom of a highly polished wooden chest next to a bed with a ruffled comforter hanging limply off the side. A red smear of something on the screen had turned the normally white display a sickly orange. The second sight to greet her increased in gruesome detail, like a picture coming into focus as the door widened. Lying on the floor, her body bathed in the e-reader's light, was the Elliott's neighbor. The young woman was positioned awkwardly on the ground. Her head and face had been reduced to a chunky pulp. Resting against the rune of her head was an oval hunk of glass. Flecks of skull and brain along with a healthy wash of blood nearly covered the entirety of the object. In the dim light, the words, "Willem Elliott, Businessman of the Year, 1996, could be seen. Olivia realized the shunk had been the sound of the award being driven repeatedly into the girl's head. She raised her free hand to her mouth, her palm effectively trapping the screen, which threatened to erupt. Blood-stained fingers appeared around the edge of the open door and heaved it the rest of the way open. Standing before her, backlit by the e-reader, was Willem Elliott. He was not a big man, but in that moment he seemed to completely fill the frame. His bony arms and legs looked stick-like, contrasted with his sagging paunch of a belly. He was wearing boxer shorts and a white undershirt. Both articles of clothing were spattered with blood. All these details, like individual drops of rain, were lost in the storm that was Mr. Elliott's face. His mouth hung open at an impossible angle. Several of his teeth were missing. The corners of his lips were torn and bleeding. Multiple lines of blood and saliva hung in ropes off his chin. "Mr. Elliott," she whispered. As soon as the name left her mouth, something physical left his. It appeared quickly, a shiny black head preceding a segmented body. A large insect, about the size of a small cat, emerged from Willem Elliott's damaged maw amid a series of retching coughs and burps. The creature climbed up the elderly man's face, horrid little legs finding purchase in the folds of his skin. It stopped once it reached his forehead. Clinging there, half free from the old man's mouth, the bug began to hiss. Olivia could not stop her scream this time.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.